Well, thank you for the introduction, Victor. This paper is a collaborative work between me, Lisa Kaida, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at McMaster, and Feng Hao at Statistics Canada. So our research is motivated by a growing international interest in Canada's refugee private sponsorship program, and especially since 2015's so-called migrant crisis. And one recent report by the Migration Policy Institute hails Canada's private sponsorship program as a shining example of community-based refugee resettlement. However, what's interesting about this whole refugee sponsorship program is that we don't know too much about the long-term economic benefit of such refugee private sponsorship, even though in Canada we have this program around 40 years or so. And in Canada, most of the academic research on this refugee private sponsorship is a policy evaluation critiquing the private sponsorship program itself. There are also a handful of qualitative studies on the lived experience of privately sponsored refugees as well as their sponsors. But they tend to focus on specific time periods like 1970s or 80s, as well as specific communities like Vietnamese refugees in Victoria only. And more recent years, some quantitative research is comparing the economic outcomes of refugees from different entry classes, like privately sponsored refugees versus government-assisted refugees, but they only look at the short-term economic outcomes. So to address such existing research gaps, we're addressing two research questions. The first one is, does private sponsorship of refugee have short and long-term economic benefits? In other words, we're interested to know whether privately sponsored refugees are doing better economically than the government-assisted refugees, which is another main stream of refugee program in Canada. And our second research question is, do the economic benefits of private sponsorship vary by refugees' initial level of human capital? This is based on the reality that refugees in Canada are a heterogeneous group in terms of their human capital levels, which is different from the economic immigrants who are admitted into Canada based on their human capital. And we expect that refugees with lower human capital benefit more from this private sponsorship program because their human capital deficit may be compensated by the social capital they could possibly gain from their local sponsors. So before we move on to the data analysis part, let me first speak a little bit about this Canada's private-sponsored refugee program. So it has been going on for 40 years. And there are several actors who can sponsor refugees, including a so-called group of 5 individuals or more, as well as organizations like ethnic organizations, as well as the sponsorship agreement holders like religious groups. And what they can do, what they're supposed to do, required to do, is to provide financial and social support to their refugees up to 12 months after their arrival or until they're self-sufficient economically. And this program is at contrast to the government-assisted refugee program, which is another main stream of a refugee program in Canada. And those refugees, the GAR refugees, receive support from the government, including language training, employment support, and financial support. And oftentimes, the destination of the refugees are often predetermined by the government. And in our study of the economic integration of privately sponsored refugees versus the government-assisted refugees, we draw on an emerging argument that migration type is a key source of inequality in immigrants' integration into the whole society. Immigrants from different classes of entry have different motivation for migration, pre-migration circumstances, selection processes, legal status, and host country receptivity. Among these factors, we're particularly interested in the role of host country receptivity because that's what differentiates privately sponsored refugees from the government-assisted refugees. For other factors, there is not much difference between the two groups. So both privately sponsored refugees and government-assisted refugees have the same legal status in the sense that they are granted the permanent resident status upon arrival in Canada. And they're both eligible for government support available to other permanent residents as well. And the motivation and pre-migration circumstances of these two groups of refugees are quite similar. They're often forced out of their home country due to war, political persecution, or violence, and they're seeking protection and a safe space to rebuild their lives in Canada. And sociologists Portes and Rambaud in the United States identify 3 types of support in their discussion of the context of reception that influences the economic integration of immigrants as well as refugees, such as government, societal, and communal support. In Canada, both government-assisted refugees and privately sponsored refugees receive support from the government in terms of language training and employment support. However, privately sponsored refugees receive less government support compared to the government-assisted refugees because PSRs don't get financial support from the government for the first 1 year in Canada, unlike the GARs. Instead, PSRs receive more societal and communal support from their sponsors, as well as the community where they are settling into. So previous qualitative research suggests that PSRs are, in general, doing better than GARs in terms of the economic integration, because the societal and communal support that they receive from the sponsors and local communities could be more helpful to find jobs quickly using their local networks and earn higher. So to address our research questions, we analyzed Statistics Canada's longitudinal immigration database, IMDb. And luckily, I was one of the few academic researchers who have been given sort of early access to this data as part of Statistics Canada's pilot project. IMDb is administrative data that contain both the landing record and tax record of immigrants and refugees who landed in Canada in 1980 and onward. And the IMDb is virtually a 100% sample of immigrants and refugees who landed over the past 35 years and filed taxes in Canada at least once. And the sample bar analysis is privately sponsored refugees and the government-assisted refugees who landed in Canada in 1980 to 2009, who are at the age of 20 and 54 at the time of landing. And other categories of refugees, such as in Canada asylum seekers, refugee dependent, blended visa office referred refugees are excluded from our analysis. And our dependent variables are twofold. First, we use employment status, which is based on the information on the presence of the positive annual employment income in the tax record part of the IMDb. And this is a dichotomous variable. So for each year, we are able to identify whether a refugee was employed or not. And our second dependent variable is earnings, which is based on the information on the positive employment income, including wages and salaries from the tax record. And in our multivariate analysis, we use logged earnings, and it's a continuous variable. And we adjusted the earnings to the 2015 Consumer Price Index. Our focal independent variables are also twofold. The first one is refugee entry class, which has two categories, privately sponsored refugees and the government-assisted refugees, which is our reference group. And our second independent variable is years since landing. Based on our preliminary analysis, we decided to treat the first 2 years in Canada as dummy variables instead of treating time as a completely continuous term. Because the relative benefit of private sponsorship can be largest in the first 1 year when sponsors are required to provide financial and social support to the refugees. And then the effect of such direct support to the refugees may further last to the second year. For that reason, we decided to dummy code the first year and the second year in Canada, as opposed to the linear term. And in our multivariate analysis, we also control a series of human capital characteristics at the time of arrival in Canada, as well as other landing characteristics, and also post-migration characteristics, which could vary in each year. So for that reason, we treat post-migration characteristics as time-varying variables. And for both the employment and earnings variables, we use OLS regression. And for the employment analysis, we use linear probability model within the OLS regression. And to calculate standard errors, we consider cluster robust standard errors because the data are clustered at the provincial level. One of our control variable is the provincial level unemployment rate, so that in that sense, the data are clustered around the province level. And also that our data are clustered by the year in terms of the refugee person year data analysis within the sort of longitudinal framework. And we conduct separate models by gender for women and men. And in the next 2 slides, we're showing results of the observed outcomes, meaning that we're not controlling for any landing or post-landing characteristics at this moment. So the first slide is for the observed employment rates for PSR and GARs, men and women, from the first year in Canada up until the 15th year in Canada. So what this graph shows is that for both women and men, PSR's employment rates are particularly high in the first year in Canada. PSR men and the PSR women here, the blue bars in general. So reflective of the fact that they're getting social support as well, social support from their sponsors who are probably keen on helping them find a job. And then their high employment rates dip a little bit in the second and third year, and then their rates sort of stabilizes since after year 3 and onward. In contrast, GAR's employment rates are particularly notably lower in the first 1 year, and then over time their employment rates steadily go up, especially for women. But what this graph shows is that throughout the first 15 years in Canada, for both women and men, PSRs are more likely to be able to find a job compared to GARs. And then the next slide shows the observed earnings for GARs and PSRs up until the 15th year in Canada. And again, overall, throughout the first 15 years in Canada, PSRs are more likely to be earning higher compared to the GARs, as these blue lines for PSR men and PSR women shows, which is higher than their GAR counterparts. So far, the results that I'm showing you are observed results, meaning that we're not controlling for any landing or post-landing characteristics. So meaning that we're not taking into account the observed differences in those characteristics between PSRs and GARs. But we do notice that there are major differences between these two groups. So for example, people from East European countries, especially Poland, are concentrated, overrepresented among PSRs. As well, 40% of the PSRs in our sample have settled in Toronto first, whereas GARs are more spread out across Canada as the first destination, the first place of residence in Canada. And furthermore, PSRs are slightly more educated than the GARs, although the majority of both groups have no high school education. So then the results from here are based on our OLS regression results, where we control for such observed differences between GARs and PSRs. And from now on, I am going to show you the expected estimated gaps between GARs and PSRs in terms of the estimated employment rates or estimated logged earnings when other observed characteristics are controlled. Or since PSRs are doing better economically than GARs, when I say gap, this is basically about PSRs' employment and earnings advantage over GARs. So what this graph shows is that so throughout the first 15 years in Canada, even after we control for the group differences between GARs and PSRs, in this case, PSL men are more likely to be employed than GARs, especially for the first few years in Canada. And eventually, PSR's employment advantage diminishes over time. But what we can tell from our analysis is that even after the 15th year in Canada, PSR men are more likely to be employed than GAR men. And the same applies to refugee women as well in terms of their estimated probability of employment. Meaning that for the first few years in Canada, PSR women are particularly more likely to be employed than their GAR counterparts. And then their advantage diminishes over time, yet even after 15th year in Canada, PSR women are more likely to be employed than GAR women. This is a bit of a contrast from the qualitative research on the experience of privately sponsored refugees in some certain specific communities, because they tend to find that privately sponsored refugee women tend to receive less support, less help from their sponsors compared to their husband for whatever reasons. But our analysis finds that refugee women, PSR women, do benefit from the private sponsorship in terms of finding work as much as men do. And our finding may be different from such existing qualitative research because we're able to control for the human capital and other observable characteristics of the refugees, which is not usually the case in qualitative research on the experience of refugees. So now we're moving on to the second research question of whether the economic benefit of private sponsorship varies by refugees' initial level of human capital, represented by level of education or the knowledge of English or language, English or French at the time of landing. And this results are refugee women's logged earnings. And what this graph shows is that the earning advantage of the least educated privately sponsored refugee women is larger and lasts longer compared to refugees with more like a high educated background, as this yellow bar, which stands for the advantage of PSR women's earning over the GAR women for the least educated group, less than high school education, compared to more highly educated PSRs whose earning advantage quickly diminishes somewhere around year 5, somewhere around year 3 or year 7, sort of earlier stage of their resettlement. And the same applies, we found something similar to refugee men as well. But we want to emphasize that there is a greater benefit of private sponsorship for the less educated women, especially for women, meaning that their benefit of private sponsorship is kind of pronounced more for refugee women compared to refugee men. And when we interact the entry class with the language skill, we find that refugees with limited host language skills are not necessarily benefit from private sponsorship in the long run than refugees who knew English and French at arrival. The initial advantage of PSRs with limited language skill quickly disappears by year 2. This is rather like a surprising result, as we expected that refugees with less human capital would benefit more from private sponsorship, but our data suggests that this was not in fact the case. So then our conclusion is that we did confirm the PSR's short and long-term economic advantage over GARs. And we also find that female refugees benefit from private sponsorship as much as male refugees do. We also found that the long-term economic advantage of private sponsorship is greater among less educated refugees, but such advantage does not differ by the refugees' initial language skills. And finally, what are the implications of our research? This refugee private sponsorship program has been developing other countries as well, especially since the 2015 migration crisis. But indeed, there are wide international variations in such private sponsorship program. For example, Germany's program only sponsored Syrian refugees, and they grant temporary resident status with the possibility of renewal, as opposed to permanent resident status right at their arrival, unlike Canada. And in the case of the United States, sponsors' required support is shorter than 1 year, and the refugees depend more on welfare subsidies. But our studies suggest that this specific Canadian model of refugee private sponsorship, which has been around for the past 40 years, is indeed working from the standpoint of the economic integration of the refugees. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your feedback and questions.